One moment. All right. We have enjoyed two fantastic speakers sharing about their experience as well as providing interpreting services. Much like Stephen Stubbs mentioned, my passion is for education. Since we've had COVID-19 over the past year, I have really felt this need to figure things out to improve access for deaf and hard of hearing students. Many of you are going into the medical field, and I appreciate you staying with me and taking this information and applying it to your studies as well. Some people just think, who is Jill? And some people think of me as an educator. So let me give you a little background. First, I am deaf, but much like Steve Snow talked about his journey as a deaf person, I've encountered many similar experiences. I grew up as a deaf student. In elementary school, I went to my hometown elementary. At that time, I used hearing aids and used my voice. I didn't use sign language. I also had a personal FM system that I used. That allowed me to communicate directly with the teacher. I was able to hear what the teacher was saying, but I couldn't hear any of my classmates. I went into middle school using hearing aids and a personal FM system, and that worked. When I went into high school, I decided to transfer to Idaho School for the Deaf and Blind. I went and was thrown into the deep end, immersed in language and culture. I had always been able to communicate with the teachers, but now I was able to communicate with my peers, and I started to develop my identity as a deaf person. I started elementary school as somebody who was hard of hearing, and I honestly thought I would grow out of it and become somebody who could hear completely. When I entered the school for the deaf in high school, I realized I was going to be a deaf person, and that was fine with me. It wasn't until I was a sophomore in high school I had that realization. I stayed at the school for the deaf for 2 years, acquiring language and learning a lot of information. And then my senior year, I decided to return back to the high school near my home using an interpreter. I did have the interpreter for that senior year as well as an FM system. So I was really able to access information in both languages and have a bilingual experience through my senior year. After graduation, I attended college. I used interpreters for that entire experience. I didn't have an FM system while in college. So that's a snippet of my journey as a deaf student. I graduated with a master's of education in deaf ed. I began teaching deaf and hard of hearing kids, and I taught in a variety of settings. In some, I would work with deaf children who had an interpreter or a support person. Sometimes I was an itinerant teacher. Sometimes I was involved in a classroom at the school for the deaf, and I've experienced a variety of those settings working with deaf kids. Having seen such a plethora of experiences, both as a student and as a professional, I've had an opportunity to really see the impact of each of those on deaf and hard of hearing kids. Now I am a parent. I have 5 lovely children, 2 of whom are deaf and hard of hearing. Their needs, although there are two of them and they have the same parents, their needs are entirely different. I've recognized the need to prioritize their needs over what my preference for them would be. As somebody deaf, I have my own opinions on what would be the best access, so to speak. But I've realized that the best access for each of them is different from one another and different from mine, and that they have different choices that they would prefer. All of that is part of the constellation of who I am. People think, oh, Jill, you think you know everything about deaf education. Well, I may have experienced all of it, it seems. So I hope that you'll take that for what it's worth and realize that what I have to share with you today has some bearing. This pandemic has really highlighted this experience. Throughout my life, I have seen that sometimes the biggest impact is because I am deaf. I go into a room and it is full of people, but I still feel isolated. Often that's because I don't have access, particularly during a pandemic when people are wearing masks, even with face shields. Uh, they don't really provide that much access. There is a feeling of isolation that I think we all feel during a pandemic, but certainly deaf people are experiencing. I've asked my husband, is this actually something that I came up with, or did someone else say that? And he said, I've never heard anybody else say it. So I am just claiming this as mine. But if you've heard it from another source, let me know and I will correct myself. Before I proceed, I think it's important for us to share a common understanding of different terminology in regards to deaf education. Some of the terms may be obvious, but deaf and hard of hearing is used for any child who has any type of hearing loss. The term hearing impaired is really out of date. It's old fashioned and not in a quaint way. It's considered offensive. Sometimes there are people who become deaf as senior citizens and they may prefer to use other terms, but hearing impaired is considered offensive. Hearing loss is still okay, and that would again apply mostly to older people. Stephen mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act, also called the ADA, and accommodations provided for deaf people. The IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, really focuses on access for all children who have disabilities. IDEA uses several terms that come up and are specific to educational settings. One is FAPE, free and appropriate public education, and that's for every child who has a disability. LRE is often called the least restrictive environment, and it's looking what's least restrictive for that child. LEA is the local education agency. Usually it means their home school district. And an IEP is an individual education plan. That plan identifies what the child needs so that they can succeed and to have appropriate education. All of these terms and jargon are all part of IDEA. But it's interesting that IDEA says free and appropriate education. And they say the least restrictive environment is going to be provided by the local education agency using an individual education plan. So the IDEA requires an FAPE and the LRE by the LEA using an IEP. That's ridiculous. Nobody has all those acronyms, but that's what applies to every person who has a disability. So I've explained the LRE and how That often is misunderstood as it applies to children who are deaf and hard of hearing. The most important thing for any child who has a disability is that they are able to be integrated with other students who do not have a disability. That's the concept of least restrictive environment, that children without disabilities are an option and an access for students who have disabilities, that they are with their typical peers. Earlier, I mentioned all the different settings in which I taught and attended school. All of those options are part of the continuum of choices and placement options in regards to deaf children. Many children who have disabilities have a variety of options that could meet their needs, and they can identify what works best. But IDEA really encourages that students be in their local schools with their typical peers. IDEA looks at special classrooms or specialized schools as being more restrictive and recommends those as one of the least popular options. So it encourages students who are deaf and hard of hearing to be around students who can hear. This graph shows a survey of a variety of people and settings and the frequency that they use, or excuse me, the frequency with which they have concerns for language and communication access. Language and communication is the concern expressed most often. The least often concern expressed is in regards to policy or legislation. What's interesting is that the policy and legislation is what really impacts all of the other options that are available. As I showed these circles, remembering that language is focused as the primary problem or concern for any deaf and hard of hearing child. If you keep that in mind, you can see the center circle here is individual, and then it gets larger as the number of people involved increase as well. But at the center of everything is the person who is developing appropriate language. However, the influence goes from the outside in terms of the influence. So the politics influences the education, which influences the community, family, and finally down to the deaf child. During a pandemic, the struggles look different. In my case, I have the two children who have hearing loss. Many things have changed over the past year. I've thought about different strategies to ensure each of them is receiving their free and appropriate public education in their local education agency, their local school. I'm not concerned about the local school. I think that they're doing an appropriate job, but I wonder, is that the least restrictive environment? And how do I protect my children from negative consequences of communication access during the pandemic? Whether people can hear or are deaf or hard of hearing, a lot of people are frustrated with the lack of visual access. I can even see my friends who can hear are frustrated by not having access to seeing facial expression. Those non manual markers are things we all rely on to tell if somebody is smiling or happy or teasing. And with masks, many of us are not certain. If people who can hear feel those frustrations, imagine how it's exacerbated for those who are deaf and hard of hearing. At the School for the Deaf, students have an opportunity to be bilingual and to get access both ways. My daughter Taylor is willing to let me share her story, so I'm not breaking any type of confidentiality. But Taylor identifies herself as deaf and has since she was very, very young. She prefers to use sign language. We've asked her if she would like to attend the local school, and she said yes with an interpreter. And so that's been what she has done. She mainstreams in our nearby school using interpreting services. That was successful for her through elementary and middle school. In high school, she found that she was struggling. And so we talked about what her options might be, if she would like to maintain her enrollment in the local school or if she wanted to attend the School for the Deaf. Last year, she was a sophomore and decided that she wanted to go to the School for the Deaf so she could have direct communication in sign language with her professor, with her teachers, as well as be able to take classes at the local high school with an interpreter if she wanted to mainstream for something there. That was really important to her. She is a very smart girl. She's very bright. She does not struggle with academics. When COVID hit, the residential school for the deaf closed, and I noticed that my daughter began to struggle in school. She was feeling very isolated, just as she had when she attended her local school. She was receiving services and had education through Zoom, through Classroom, being provided by the School for the Deaf. She had language access. She wasn't able to be with her peers. She wasn't able to socialize with them in the same way because everyone had to stay home. She felt that her emotional health was not as strong as it had been, and she started to show signs of depression and anxiety. She missed having that direct communication with both peers and instructors. Eventually, the numbers subsided enough that the school felt that they could have students come together again on campus and to remain in small pods. As soon as she knew she was heading back to the school, I could see the benefit. I could see her emotional state really improve. Now, Jordan, my third child, he is hard of hearing and he identifies himself as hard of hearing, not as deaf. He speaks well. He's able to use residual hearing. He attends a local school without an interpreter. And I have checked in with him frequently. Do you want an interpreter? Do you need an interpreter? And he says, nope, I'm fine. I'm doing great. So that worked well for him until people had to wear a mask because of the pandemic. Suddenly his access to information and visual cues was very, very limited. He came home and said, Mom, what do I do? We called a meeting to talk about what does least restrictive environment look like for him because he felt very restricted in the mainstream classroom. We requested an interpreter for him, for my hard of hearing son who had never wanted an interpreter. And he said that was fine, but he'd never used an interpreter. He didn't know how to access information using an interpreter. So that was all new for him. But between masks and the inability to socialize with peers or interact with his teachers in a meaningful way, he realized that that would be a tool for him to get some new information. So as we started a new school year, he started that experience with an interpreter. He was able to use that, and now he is feeling more comfortable using an interpreter because he recognizes that is another tool that he has to provide access. It is somewhat limited because he's not able to socialize directly with his peers who are wearing masks. And I can see that isolation is really starting to creep in for him. And I've thought, with all of my background, if my two children are struggling during the pandemic, they have parents who support them, advocate, who understand the system, who provide full language access in whatever language they need. Imagine what the impact is on kids and other families. It's time for us to look at least restrictive environment and how that could be interpreted differently for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. I know that political leaders and educational leaders at the state level and federal level think that it has a different meaning. They think it should mean that children who are deaf and hard of hearing should be in a classroom with peers who can hear. However, IDEA says that we need to consider various factors in regards to deaf and hard of hearing kids, particularly their language needs, their ability to access language in the classroom for both the teacher and their classmates, their peers. They need to be able to communicate with peers. Yes, we know it's important for them to be able to socialize with people who can hear, but they need to have full communication access. And that's not able to happen in a school that doesn't have anyone else who provides the same communication. I suggest that instead of least restrictive environment, when it comes to deaf and hard of hearing kids, we need to look at the language rich environment. And that's the LRE we should focus on. They shouldn't feel there's any barrier to communication. If the pandemic hit and all kids who are deaf and hard of hearing had access to a variety of tools, as Stephen Stubbs talked about, whether it's hearing aids or implants, whatever that may be, but if they also all had the opportunity to sign, that would provide more options. Even if they couldn't access using facial expression because of masks or lip reading because of masks, they would be able to sign and feel unrestricted. Before, you saw that language was the top concern. Now, if we look at this through a different lens, and language is not the problem, instead, we look at language mode as a resource and that children have direct communication access, both to spoken language for those for whom it's appropriate, as well as sign language for all, then that isn't a problem. Language is a resource, a support that they have, just as other students have in academic settings. I read a book some time ago called The Tipping Point. The premise of the book is that at some point you'll hit some experience in your life and it will shift your entire life. They refer to that point as the tipping point. I think the pandemic could be our tipping point for deaf education. For many years, deaf and hard of hearing children have continued to struggle academically. They've continued to struggle with being able to thrive and develop appropriate academic and language skills. If they are able to hear some, to speak some, to sign some, they've still struggled because they haven't had full access in all of the doctors, nurses, teachers, all need to be providing parents appropriate information on what's going to help their student succeed by being in a language rich environment. Time is running out, so I want to take a moment and just highlight the most important point that I need to make today. Least restrictive environment for deaf and hard of hearing kids does not mean the local public school classroom. There are many children who do thrive in that type of environment, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand and think that I am opposed to it. But as professionals and as educators, as healthcare workers, we need to ensure that all of their needs are being met. The only way we can do that is if they feel free, confident, and safe to communicate in their language with both their teachers and their peers. They need to know that they are not limited. As Steve Snow and Stephen Stubbs have said, information access is critical, and deaf and hard of hearing children should not be left behind anymore. I have a final quote for you to think about, and every time I read it, I think how important it is to share. Often the first person that parents meet once they find out they have a child who is deaf or hard of hearing is a medical provider. Are doctors and audiologists fully aware of the needs of deaf children or deaf adults? They are not. There are many deaf adults who have said, yes, I went through school and I was successful, or I went through school at the local public school, or I went through school at the school for the deaf. And they talk about their experiences, but they are ignored. So, as Julie Rems Mario says, she's been deaf her entire life. She's going to die deaf. Regardless if a person uses a cochlear implant or hearing aids, they continue to be deaf. And it's time to recognize that the deaf community, their stories need to be listened to. Their stories need to be respected and analyzed for the universal principles that can enable future generations of deaf kids to thrive. That's the thought I would like to leave with you. It's now time for questions and answers. I can take one or two before the panel if there's something now.
Yeah, if anyone has a question that they'd like to put in the Q&A.
No questions. Perfect. It means I gave a perfect presentation. Go me.
So
I'm just kidding.
we're going to give 5 minutes to take a final poll and have anyone who has some questions, they can think about them, put them in the Q&A, and then we will come back at 3:35 with our panel.
Great.
All right. So wanted to thank Jill for her thoughts and her comments. And I think she was able to wrap things very well for us. So one of the first questions, and I'll take this one, is how do we reach you? And so at the end of our conference today, we will send out contact information, and we'll make sure that on your the agenda, conference agenda, we'll have email addresses on there as well. So, and there are a couple of thank yous in the Q&A that I wanted to recognize. So one question is, How can interpreters make an impact for deaf and hard of hearing students and their right to full access, especially for kids who may not have that language background and don't know how to access through an interpreter? Jill, would you like to take that question?
I'm going to read the question in English to ensure that I'm addressing all of it, if you'll give me just a moment. I'm going to give you my utopian answer with Stephen Stubbs here, as well as our qualified interpreters. My perfect vision of education would be to have both a certified hearing interpreter as well as a certified deaf interpreter in a classroom with deaf kids the whole way through. So that's a utopian answer. It's not realistic necessarily. But I know that the role of an educational interpreter is critical, and interpreters need to possess cultural knowledge. That's true both of educational as well as community interpreters. Students who are deaf and hard of hearing in a classroom often struggle with accessing full information and all of the culturally rich information in the educational setting. An educational interpreter is part of the individual education plan team, the group that develops the IEP and recognizes what's necessary to help students fully develop and thrive. Educational interpreters have a role to provide input as an expert in the classroom for educational settings. So that's my thoughts on it.
I'd be glad to add to that. When we look at the word full access in all caps, when I think about that, I think about the classroom environment with a student sitting and an interpreter there. Now, there is passing periods where students have these opportunities to find out what they've done over the weekend, and a deaf student may not have that. People communicate in the cafeteria, and the student would not have that full inclusion. Often, the IEP team, the Individualized Education Plan team, just focuses on this academic and classroom environment. But what they fail to consider is the other activities, the between classes, the cafeteria, the interactions with the friends and after school extracurricular activities. So
Yes.
when we're talking about full inclusion, I'm so thankful that I had my experience at the residential school for the deaf. I wasn't in Idaho, I was in another state. However, when I was done with class, I could talk with my peers, make plans, joke with them, talk to them in the cafeteria. And really, it was just one big wild party all the time. But I was involved after school in sports. And so I had this opportunity to develop relationships, to learn problem solving skills, to develop a sense of self-identity, all of those other things that when you think of the word full inclusion, do they really mean full inclusion, or do they just mean inclusion in the classroom?
Thank you. Snow.
Absolutely. There are two things that I would like to add to that as well. It's important that educational interpreters set aside their pride and that they attend workshops and they continue to hone in on their skills.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, what we see is that many educational interpreters feel that they are competent enough and they don't participate in trainings and they're not involved in the community. And secondly, Stephen Stubbs mentioned the word full access. And it's scary but true. In Idaho, the way that we qualify an educational interpreter is through the Educational Performance Assessment, or the EIPA. And that minimum score to work in the state of Idaho is a 3.5 on that assessment. And that is equivalent to 60% of the message, which means that the interpreter is listening to 100% and only interpreting 60% of the message. And do we consider that acceptable? Meaning that our deaf students are only having access to 60% of their education. If we think about it, 60% isn't a full access to education. Even a 4.0 is still not at that 100% accessible level. It's impossible for a student to be able to fully access their education through a sign language interpreter. They can get close, but it will never be 100%. It's imperative that educational interpreters analyze themselves and that they be honest with themselves about their skill level. Instead of pushing those concerns aside, if they're concerned in some areas, they should be honest and upfront, and they may need to step aside in some situations and have someone else step in to interpret. Many interpreters say that they are good enough and they don't take the time to analyze themselves, so it's imperative that educational interpreters do that.
And that applies to medical interpreters as well. Any situation, really, any type of interpreter, not only educational. Every interpreter needs to know that when they are walking in to an appointment, and I can think how often interpreters may be thinking like, ooh, that's me or that's me. But for a deaf person to have full access, that's not realistic unless the person they're talking to is also using sign language.
So along those lines, what is the best way to establish or reestablish trust with a deaf client when an interpretation has not gone smoothly? And this is from an interpreting student.
I can take a stab at that. That is an issue that we have in one of our classes, in an ethics class, that we focus on really that sort of thing for an entire semester. And it's still just scratching the surface, but really there's two ways to look at it. You can think about the perspective with whether or not the interpreter is transparent with the deaf client. So if they've arrived at an appointment and they say that I'm a novice interpreter or I'm new, and they try to work things out, and they say, if I'm not going to be okay, just let me know and we'll reschedule. You can take a look at that way. Or also, we can take a look at what the deaf person needs. Perhaps it's an emotionally charged appointment, and they know that that interpreter is not appropriate for that situation. But there are those situations that are not that sort. There's a range of situations, and there's a range of interpreters, and sometimes they're layered and they can overlap. One has to think about how to solve that, and it can be discussed at length, but we do actually discuss that for those sorts of things for an entire semester with interpreters.
I'd also want to say in regards to trust, or we're still on that question, correct?
Yes.
Just in regards to trust, I would say that first impressions are long lasting.
Yes.
So when that trust is lost, I would say good luck trying to earn that back. It's very difficult to do. And the deaf community is very forgiving, but it's something that you all should keep in mind, that if that trust is broken and if you have been negligent with that, it's really hard to regain that. We know that interpreters are human, and we will always consider that. There are some situations that are highly sensitive, though, and if an interpreter does come in and breaks that trust, it's very difficult to earn that back. So I would say do it right the first time. Don't make that mistake.
Yes.
I have something else. I saw another question that was in regards to music, a person who had said that they were a music educator. And I thought that that might be, they're talking about accommodating deaf and hard of hearing students. I have to tell you, there are many deaf people who love music. Indeed, there are.
I'm
Yeah,
one of them. I love it.
especially, well, except me. I don't know. I can't, well, okay, no, not me, but
I
because I can
love,
hear
love,
it,
love,
I
love,
think
love
that
it.
there are people who do.
Jill's not normal. Just ignore that.
Anything else you want to add about how, let's see where that question went. How to include those that want to experience music in the classroom?
No, I want to go first, not me, or not Steve. I want to go first. Okay.
Yep.
So in American Sign Language, it incorporates both rhythm and rhyme. Many people don't realize that American Sign Language can incorporate the concept of a beat or of rhythm, that those things are already a part of the language when well done. So if you find someone who is a qualified language model who is doing it well, whether it's music or poetry, there's so many videos that are available now that you're able to show, and that you can see authentic native signers, and they are producing music from American Sign Language, not an interpretation of English music for people who can hear or other languages for people who can hear, but rather deaf poetry, deaf rhythm. Many schools think, oh, we should include sign language. It's so pretty. It'll be very pretty for this song. I would say be careful with that. It is easy to misunderstand how to incorporate signs. Sometimes they're applied incorrectly to English lyrics. So if the goal is just make it a pretty performance, I would caution people against that. So as somebody who is a native signer, I would say bring in somebody who knows ASL. Don't rely on videos for vocabulary.
Absolutely. Another resource that could be used for students or for teachers is called DPAN, DPAN, and that can be found on their website or on YouTube. And they have several videos of music in American Sign Language. One individual, his name is Sean Forbes. I'm not necessarily his biggest fan, but I know he's very popular in that realm. And he makes many videos that are very visually appealing, that incorporate those sounds in a visual way. And I wouldn't say many, but some individuals really like that. So that's another option to incorporate music in a visual way.
Thank you. All right, I have one for you, Steve Snow. From earlier, thanking you for your research and the work that went into that. And this individual loves the idea of diversity in the medical field. However, they have witnessed and know of many deaf individuals who have tried to complete a medical program. So as the student, a medical program, but the amount of discrimination they face in these programs is a huge obstacle. So how do we educate the educators?
Absolutely. That's a great question. One of my good friends, Zach Featherstone, he is well recognized nationally for his case of discrimination when he was in medical school. And the National Association of the Deaf actually sued that medical school and won that case. At that point, Dr. Featherstone decided to transfer schools and completed his training there. There are many deaf individuals, like this person asked, that have experienced that and have experienced discrimination to the point where they have not finished. From what I have heard, even after they have submitted a complaint of discrimination, they're often neglected and excused from that program, saying that they don't qualify to finish. There are quite a few deaf students who are currently in the process of going through medical school, so it's promising, but there definitely needs to be more awareness and more instruction for those educators. Unfortunately, autism is rampant in the medical field and in that culture. And what that means is that they are focused on the ear only instead of on the person as an individual. I've noticed some cultural shifts and some minute changes, and I'm hoping that we continue to see that. There are so many competent deaf individuals who can be successful if they choose to enter the medical field. And who knows, one day they could even find cures for horrific diseases, but we need to be able to give them the opportunity to become a doctor first.
If I could chime in with that, we've talked about autism. Doctors and medical professionals often suffer from ableism. They see everything as something broken that must be fixed. I would encourage them to look at it through a different framework. Just look at multiple abilities. So instead of looking at what people cannot do, focus on what they are able to do. When people go in to see a medical professional, they come in with skills, with knowledge, with ability. They aren't coming in as something broken to be fixed. Zach Featherstone's approach in his case are something that the deaf community really celebrated. The deaf community, it feels like one of our own is now in the field that we could get full access. I think, as Steve said, change is coming. You will see a tidal wave of change.
Absolutely. For our participants today that are entering the medical field, I would encourage you to do your part. We can partner together to make that change. Instead of just taking today as just some neat information, you can take this on and apply it to the medical field.
Yes. Often parents meet a doctor as one of their first professionals after they find out that they have a child who's deaf and hard of hearing. They don't know where to find deaf adults, and that's not who they go to first. They trust the medical providers, and so they'll go to the doctor or audiologist and say, "Hey, I have this deaf kid. What can I do?" And I think that this is where medical providers can really establish a rapport with the deaf community, and we're seeing that happen more and more. That change is coming.
So one last comment here. Two. One is a thank you for bringing up the idea of 60% with the EIPA. And the other is that hopefully this is the tipping point. And just a big thank you for sharing all of this vital information. And so with that, I'll give a couple of concluding remarks. And so if I'm going to share my screen again, if our panelists want to turn off their videos, thank you again so very much.